How could a man declared dead watch his enemies from the shadows of London? Was Sherlock Holmes truly gone, or was his disappearance the greatest deception of his life? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's tale is The Adventure of the Empty House by Arthur Conan Doyle, a classic tale reimagined and retold for the modern age. In the spring of 1894, London held its breath. Whispers moved faster than carriages, and polite society found itself shaken by a crime so strange that no one could explain it. The victim was the Honorable Ronald Adair, a man of status, fortune, and impeccable reputation, found dead under circumstances that seemed to mock logic itself. The newspapers reported what the police allowed them to know. Statements were printed. Conclusions were drawn. The public believed it had seen the full picture, but it hadn't, not even close. At the time, the evidence was so crushingly one-sided that many details were deliberately left unspoken. There was no need for them, they said. Justice appeared inevitable. And so the deeper truths, the fragments that truly mattered, were locked away, unseen and unheard. Now, nearly 10 years later, I can finally speak. What follows completes that broken chain of events. And while the murder itself was baffling enough, it was merely the doorway to something far more astonishing, something that would strike me with a force unlike anything I had ever experienced before or since. Even now, recalling it sends a shiver through me. I remember the exact moment when disbelief gave way to wonder, when shock dissolved into something brighter, almost overwhelming, a sudden surge of joy and amazement that swept every rational thought from my mind. To those readers who have followed my occasional accounts of an extraordinary man's thoughts and actions, I owe an explanation. My silence was not neglect, nor was it betrayal of the truth. I would have spoken long ago had I been permitted to do so, but I was bound by a direct command given firmly and without compromise. That restriction was lifted only last month. My association with Sherlock Holmes had long since sharpened my interest in crime. After his disappearance, I followed every notable case with obsessive care, hoping, perhaps foolishly, to glimpse traces of his reasoning in the work of others. More than once, in private moments, I attempted to apply his methods myself. I failed more often than I succeeded. Yet among all the tragedies that crossed my path during those silent years, none seized my imagination like the death of Ronald Adair. It lingered in my thoughts, it refused to be forgotten, and, unknown to me then, it was about to become the turning point of everything I believed to be true. As I followed the testimony given at the inquest, testimony that ended with a verdict of deliberate murder by an unknown hand, I became painfully aware of how deeply the world had been diminished by the loss of Sherlock Holmes. This was exactly the kind of case that would have ignited his curiosity. Every strange detail, every contradiction, every silence between the facts, it all seemed to cry out for his presence. I had no doubt that had he still been alive, the police investigation would not merely have benefited from his insight, but would likely have been overtaken by it. His sharp perception and restless intellect would have raced ahead of official methods, as they so often had before. That entire day, as my carriage rolled through the streets of London, the case refused to leave my thoughts. I examined it again and again, turning each fact over like a puzzle piece that stubbornly refused to fit. No matter how I arranged them, no explanation felt complete. Something essential was missing. And so, even at the risk of repeating what many already believed they knew, I must restate the known facts as they stood when the inquest closed, before speculation hardened into accepted truth. Ronald Adair was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth, who at that time governed one of Britain's distant Australian colonies. His mother had returned to England for a delicate operation on her eyes, and during her recovery she lived quietly at 427 Park Lane with her 2 children, Ronald and his sister, Hilda. By all outward appearances, Ronald Adair was the last man one would expect to meet a violent end. He moved easily among the highest circles of society. He had no known enemies, no dark habits, no scandals trailing his name. For a time he had been engaged to Miss Edith Woodley of Carstairs, but the engagement had ended months earlier, peacefully, by mutual agreement, and left behind no sign of bitterness or heartbreak. His life followed a predictable rhythm, calm, respectable, unremarkable. He was not driven by passion nor troubled by ambition, an easy-going young aristocrat, content with routine and convention. And yet it was upon this very man that death descended, swiftly, silently, and in a manner so bizarre that it defied all expectation. Sometime between 10 o'clock and 11:20 on the night of March 30th, 1894, Ronald Adair's life was extinguished. Cards, it was known, were one of his few indulgences. He played often, but never recklessly, and never for sums that could trouble his considerable means. He belonged to several exclusive clubs, the Baldwin, the Cavendish, and the Bagatelle. On the evening of his death, after dining as usual, he had spent several hours at the Bagatelle Club, engaged in a routine game of whist. Nothing about that night appeared unusual. Nothing hinted at danger. Nothing suggested that it would be the last ordinary evening he would ever know. And yet, before the night had fully passed, Ronald Adair would be dead, leaving behind a mystery that mocked reason, haunted London, and would soon challenge everything I believed about loss, truth, and the finality of death. He had returned to the club earlier that same afternoon as well. Those who played alongside him, Mr. Murray, Sir John Hardy, and Colonel Moran, later confirmed that the game had been whist, calm and orderly, with no dramatic swings of fortune. The cards had fallen evenly. At worst, Adair might have lost a few pounds, 5 at most, a trivial sum for a man of his wealth, incapable of stirring even mild concern. Money, after all, was never his weakness. His estate was substantial, and losses of that size barely registered. He played frequently, almost daily, moving between clubs with the steady confidence of a cautious gambler who understood restraint. More often than not, he left the table ahead. In fact, evidence revealed that only weeks earlier, partnered with Colonel Moran, he had walked away from a single sitting with winnings exceeding £400, taken from Godfrey Milner and Lord Balmoral. That, in short, was the financial portrait presented at the inquest. No desperation, no debt, no motive rooted in loss. As for the night itself, the timeline seemed deceptively simple. Ronald Adair returned home from the club at precisely 10 o'clock. His mother and sister were not there. They had gone out to spend the evening with a relative. The house was quiet. According to the servant, she heard him enter the front room on the second floor, a room he often used as a private sitting room. Earlier she had prepared the fireplace, but when smoke began to spill into the room, she opened the window to clear the air. After that, nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no sound of movement whatsoever. Silence reigned until 11:20, when Lady Maynooth and her daughter finally returned. Before retiring for the night, Lady Maynooth decided to say good night to her son. She went to his sitting room and found the door locked from the inside. She knocked. She called his name. There was no reply. Concern quickly turned to alarm. Assistance was summoned. With growing fear, the door was forced open. What they found inside defied comprehension. Ronald Adair lay near the table. His body was still. His head had been destroyed by a single gunshot fired at close range from an expanding revolver bullet. Yet no firearm lay anywhere in the room, no weapon of any kind, no sign of a struggle, nothing to explain how such a wound had been inflicted or by whom. On the table, money had been carefully arranged. 2 10-pound note banks lay beside small, deliberate stacks of silver and gold, 17 pounds and 10 shillings in total, sorted into neat piles of varying size. Nearby rested a sheet of paper marked with columns of figures, names of club acquaintances beside them. It appeared that Adair had been calmly calculating his winnings and losses, engaged in nothing more sinister than bookkeeping, right up until the moment death overtook him. A locked room, no weapon, no money untouched, a man dead in absolute silence. These were the facts placed before the public, and yet even then I could not shake the certainty that they explained nothing at all. A closer inspection of the scene only deepened the mystery. Every answer seemed to generate 2 more questions. To begin with, there was no logical reason for Ronald Adair to have locked the door from the inside, none whatsoever. One theory suggested that the killer had secured the door afterward and escaped through the open window, but that explanation collapsed the moment it was examined. The drop from the window was more than 20 feet. Below it lay a flower bed of crocuses in full bloom, their petals untouched, their fragile stems unbroken. The soil beneath them was smooth and undisturbed. Even the narrow strip of grass between the house and the road showed no sign that a foot had ever crossed it. No escape had taken place that way, which meant, disturbingly, that the door must have been locked by Adair himself. But then came the impossible question. If he was alone, how did he die? No one could have climbed up to the window without leaving unmistakable traces, and the idea that someone had fired from outside bordered on the absurd. To deliver such a devastating wound with a revolver from that distance through glass would require a level of precision bordering on the supernatural. Then there was the sound, or rather the complete absence of it. Park Lane was never silent. Carriages passed constantly. A cab stand stood less than 100 yards from the house, and yet no one, no servant, no passerby, no driver had heard a gunshot. Not a single report echoed through the street that night. And still the evidence refused to be denied. There was the body. There was the bullet, soft-nosed, expanded on impact, designed to tear rather than pierce. A wound so catastrophic that death must have been instantaneous. Thus stood the facts of what the papers would soon call the Park Lane mystery, a puzzle made even darker by the complete absence of motive. Ronald Adair had no enemies, no debts, no secrets that anyone could uncover. And though money and valuables lay openly displayed in the room, nothing had been taken. No theft, no struggle, no explanation. From morning until night I carried these contradictions with me, turning them over endlessly in my mind. I searched for a theory, any theory that could bind them together. I even attempted to follow the investigative principle my lost friend had once taught me, to seek the path of least resistance, the explanation that demanded the fewest assumptions. I failed. By early evening, mentally exhausted, I wandered aimlessly across the park. Without realizing it, my steps carried me toward the Oxford Street end of Park Lane. It was nearly 6 o'clock when I arrived. There, a small crowd had gathered on the pavement, idle onlookers drawn together by nothing more than shared curiosity. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces tilted upward, eyes fixed on a single window above. I followed their gaze, and in that instant I knew I was standing before the very house that had haunted my thoughts all day. Among the onlookers stood a tall, angular man wearing tinted glasses. Something about him, his posture, his certainty, made me suspect he was no ordinary spectator, but a detective working quietly without uniform. He was expounding a theory with great confidence, his finger raised as the crowd pressed closer, eager to hear his conclusions. I edged nearer, curious despite myself. Within moments, my interest turned to irritation. His ideas were clumsy, his logic careless, and his conclusions strained beyond credibility. With a feeling not unlike embarrassment on behalf of reason itself, I stepped back and turned away. That was when I collided with someone behind me. The man was elderly and misshapen, his body bent by age or infirmity. At the impact, several books slipped from his arms and scattered across the pavement. I stooped at once to retrieve them, murmuring apologies as I did so. One title caught my eye as I lifted it from the ground: The Origin of Tree Worship. An unusual choice. It occurred to me that this unfortunate fellow must be a lover of obscure literature, perhaps a dealer in rare books or a collector driven by some private obsession. My apology, however sincere, was poorly received. The books, it was clear, were treasured possessions, and my clumsiness had offended him deeply. He responded with a low, contemptuous snarl, wrenched the volumes back into his grasp, and turned sharply away. I caught a final glimpse of his hunched back and white side whiskers as he vanished into the crowd, swallowed by the same curiosity that had drawn us all there. Left alone once more, I turned my attention fully to number 427. The house itself offered little comfort to my reasoning. A low wall and iron railing separated it from the street, no more than 5 feet in height. Anyone could have entered the small garden without effort, but the window above told a different story. There was no drain pipe, no ledge, no architectural feature that could assist even the most agile intruder. It might as well have been suspended in mid-air. The contradictions returned with renewed force. More perplexed than when I had arrived, I eventually abandoned the scene and made my way back to Kensington, my thoughts no less tangled than before. I had been in my study barely 5 minutes when the maid entered to announce that a visitor wished to see me. I gave a distracted assent. Then I looked up and froze. Standing before me was the same strange old man from Park Lane. His sharp, weathered face emerged from a halo of white hair, his eyes bright with something unreadable. Tucked tightly beneath his right arm was an entire stack of books, no fewer than a dozen, clutched as if they were priceless relics. "You seem surprised to see me, sir," he croaked, his voice thin and rasping, yet edged with unmistakable intent. I admitted that I was. And even as the words left my mouth, a sudden inexplicable unease settled over me, an instinctive sense that this unexpected visit marked the beginning of something far greater than coincidence. "Well," the old man rasped, shifting his weight as if the words themselves were an effort, "I've got a conscience, sir. When I saw you enter this house, and me limping along behind, I said to myself, I will just call on that gentleman. I wanted you to know that if I seemed short-tempered earlier, no offense was intended, and I am truly grateful to you for rescuing my books." I waved the matter aside. "It was nothing at all," I replied. Then, curiosity getting the better of me, I added, "But may I ask, how did you know who I was?" He chuckled softly. "If you'll pardon the familiarity, sir, I'm something of a neighbor. My little bookshop sits on the corner of Church Street. You're most welcome there any time. Perhaps you're a collector yourself." He shifted the stack under his arm, angling the titles toward me. "British Birds, Catullus, The Holy War, fine copies, every one. With just a few of these, you could neatly fill that empty space on your second shelf. It does look a bit untidy, doesn't it? Without thinking, I turned my head to glance at the cabinet behind me. When I faced forward again, the room had changed. The crooked old man was gone. In his place, standing calmly on the far side of my study table, lips curved in a familiar, infuriating smile, was Sherlock Holmes. I stood up. I stared. For several long seconds, my mind refused to accept what my eyes insisted upon. Then the world dissolved. A grey haze surged upward, swallowing the room. I have no memory of falling, only of returning, slowly, to sensation. My collar had been loosened. A sharp warmth lingered on my tongue. Brandy. Holmes was leaning over me, his flask still in his hand, his expression a blend of concern and unmistakable amusement. "My dear Watson," he said gently, in that voice I knew better than my own thoughts, "I owe you 1,000 apologies. I truly had no idea my return would have such an effect on you." I seized him by the arms, half afraid he might vanish again if I let go. "Holmes," I cried, "is it really you? Are you alive? Can it be true? Did you escape that dreadful abyss?" He raised a hand, steadying me, and perhaps himself. "Just a moment," he said. "Are you certain you're strong enough for explanations? I fear my reappearance was unnecessarily theatrical." And as he spoke, the impossible truth began to take shape before me. The dead man lived. The legend had returned, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. "I'm all right," I said at last, though my voice betrayed me. "But Holmes, I can scarcely trust my own sight. To think that you, of all men, are standing here, in my study." Once more, instinctively, I caught hold of his sleeve. Beneath the fabric I felt solid muscle, lean, sinewy, unmistakably real. "Well," I managed, half laughing, half breathless, "you're no ghost, at least. My dear fellow, I can't tell you what it means to see you alive. Sit down, please, and tell me how you climbed back from that terrible abyss." He took the chair opposite me and struck a match with the same careless elegance I remembered so well. As he lit his cigarette, I noticed the details my shock had previously missed. He was still dressed as the shabby book dealer, though the remnants of that disguise, white hair and battered volumes, now lay discarded on the table. He seemed leaner than before, sharper somehow, but his hawk-like features were drained of color. That unhealthy pallor spoke of years lived under strain, secrecy, and constant danger. "I'm grateful for the chance to straighten myself, Watson," he said lightly. "It's no small discomfort for a tall man to reduce his height by a full foot at a time." Then his tone shifted, just slightly. "Now, as for explanations, with your cooperation, we have a long and perilous night ahead of us. It may be wiser for me to tell you everything once that work is done." I shook my head at once. "My curiosity won't allow that. I would much rather hear it now." He studied me for a moment, then asked quietly, "You'll come with me tonight?" I answered without hesitation, "Anywhere, any time." A faint smile crossed his face. "That does sound like the old days. We'll have time for a brief dinner before we set out. Very well, then, let us begin with that chasm." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "I had no great difficulty escaping it, for the simplest of reasons." I leaned forward. "I was never in it." I stared at him. "Never in it?" "No, Watson, never. The note I sent you was entirely sincere. I truly believed my career had reached its end, at least very nearly, for when I saw the unmistakable figure of Professor Moriarty waiting on that narrow ledge leading to safety, I knew the danger was real and immediate. His eyes darkened as the name hung in the air. And in that instant I understood. What I had mourned as a death, what the world had accepted as final, had been only the opening move in a far greater game, one played in shadows against the most dangerous mind Holmes had ever faced. There was no mistaking the expression in his gray eyes. A cold resolve lived there, unyielding, deliberate. We exchanged a few brief words. Then, with perfect composure, I obtained his polite consent to write the short note that would later reach you. I placed it carefully beside my cigarette case and walking stick, deliberate tokens meant to tell a very specific story. After that, I continued along the narrow path, fully aware that Moriarty followed close behind me. When I reached the end, there was nowhere left to retreat. I turned to face him. He did not draw a weapon. He did not hesitate. With a sudden rush, he lunged forward and wrapped his long arms around me. He knew his grand design had failed. At that moment, his only desire was revenge, to drag me down with him. We swayed together on the very edge of the abyss, but I was not unprepared. I possess some familiarity with baritsu, a Japanese method of combat that has proven its value to me more than once. As Moriarty tightened his grip, I twisted free with a practiced movement. He lost his footing. For several seconds he flailed wildly, screaming as his boots scraped uselessly against the rock, his hands clutching at empty air. It was futile. I leaned forward just in time to see him fall, his body shrinking rapidly as it plunged downward. He struck a rock, rebounded once, and then vanished into the torrent below. Holmes finished the account calmly, punctuating the moment with a slow draw on his cigarette. I could scarcely contain myself. "But the footprints!" I exclaimed. "I saw them myself, 2 sets going down the path and none returning." A faint smile touched his lips. That, he said, was the moment when fortune revealed its hand. The instant Moriarty disappeared, the true scope of my situation became clear to me. He was not the only man who wished me dead. At least 3 others, capable, relentless, and utterly dangerous, had sworn vengeance upon me. With their master gone, their hatred would not fade. It would sharpen. Had I remained alive in the world's eyes, one of them would eventually have succeeded. But if I were believed dead, then they would grow careless, they would surface, they would expose themselves. And one by one, I could eliminate them. Only then, when the web had been cleared, would it be safe for me to return. My mind worked with astonishing speed. I am convinced that this entire strategy had formed fully before Professor Moriarty's body ever reached the bottom of the Reichenbach Falls. Thus, from death itself, I fashioned a weapon, and from the world's certainty of my end, I created the perfect disguise. I straightened myself and studied the cliff behind me. In the account you later wrote, one I read with genuine interest, you described that wall as sheer. It wasn't. Not entirely. There were small imperfections in the rock, shallow footholds, and the faint suggestion of a narrow ledge above. Climbing the entire face was out of the question, but remaining on the path was equally impossible. The ground was wet, soft. Any movement would leave unmistakable traces. I considered reversing my boots, as I had done before, but that would only have created 3 sets of footprints heading in the same direction. Even the dullest observer would have sensed a trick. So I chose the only option that carried even a chance of success. I climbed. It was not a pleasant undertaking, Watson. The roar of the waterfall thundered beneath me, relentless and deafening. I am not a man prone to imagination, yet I swear that more than once I thought I could hear Moriarty's voice rising from the depths below, screaming, echoing, calling me down. One error meant death. Time and again the rock betrayed me. Grass tore loose in my hand. My foot slipped in the slick grooves carved by water and age. More than once I was certain that the end had come, that I was about to follow my enemy into the abyss. But I persisted. Slowly, painfully, I forced my way upward, until at last I reached a narrow ledge, several feet deep, carpeted in soft green moss. There, hidden completely from view, I lay down and waited, sheltered in a comfort that felt almost unreal after the struggle. And there I remained, stretched out in silence, while you, my dear Watson, and your well-meaning companions conducted your investigation below. I watched as you examined the scene with great sympathy and very little efficiency. Eventually, as was inevitable, you reached your conclusions, thorough, confident, and entirely wrong. You departed for the hotel, leaving the falls behind you, leaving me behind as well. I believed then that my adventures had finally come to an end, that fate had spent its last surprise upon me. I was mistaken. Without warning, a massive stone tore past my hiding place, struck the path with a thunderous crash, and bounced violently into the chasm below. For a heartbeat, I assumed it to be an accident, until I looked up. Against the darkening sky, I saw the outline of a man's head. Almost at once, another rock hurtled down and smashed into the ledge itself, landing less than a foot from where I lay. There could be no doubt about it. Moriarty had not come alone, and even in death, his shadow still reached for me. There was another man, Holmes said quietly, a partner, and from that single glimpse I caught of him, I knew exactly how lethal he was. While Moriarty confronted me on the path, this accomplice stayed hidden, watching. He witnessed his leader's fall. He saw me survive, and instead of fleeing, he waited, calm, patient. Then he made his way around the mountain, climbed above the cliff, and tried to finish what Moriarty had failed to do. I didn't have the luxury of reflection, Watson. I saw that same hard face appear again above the edge, and I understood instantly what would follow. Another stone. I dropped from the ledge. Climbing up had been difficult, terrifying even, but descending was madness. I doubt I could have attempted it under ordinary circumstances. Fear usually paralyzes the mind, but I had no time to feel fear. A rock whistled past my head as I dangled from the edge by my fingertips. Halfway down, I lost my grip. By sheer providence, I survived the fall. I struck the path below, cut, bruised, bleeding, but alive. I did not pause to assess the damage. I ran. I ran through the mountains for 10 miles in complete darkness, driven by instinct alone. No lights, no roads, only the certainty that stopping meant death. A week later, I was in Florence, and for the first time I knew something extraordinary. No one on earth knew whether I lived or died. There was only one man who shared the truth, my brother, Mycroft. For that deception, Watson, I owe you my deepest apologies. But the illusion of my death had to be flawless, and you, honest, loyal, incapable of false grief, were the final essential piece. Had you known the truth, you could never have written such a convincing account of my end. More than once over the last 3 years I began letters addressed to you. Every time I destroyed them. I feared your affection might betray me through a word, a gesture, a moment of careless relief. That is why earlier this evening I turned away when you knocked over my books. I was still in danger then. Any spark of recognition in your expression, any flicker of shock or joy, could have exposed me. The consequences would have been catastrophic. As for Mycroft, necessity forced my hand. I required funds, and there was no other mind I trusted with the truth. Thus I lived as a ghost, watching, waiting, until the moment came to step back into the light. The course of events in London had not gone quite as I had hoped. The trial of Moriarty's bang had left two of its most dangerous members, my own most vindictive enemies, at large. For the next 2 years I travelled far and wide. I spent time in Tibet, visiting Lhasa, and meeting with the head Lama. Perhaps you have read of the explorations of a Norwegian named Sigurdsson, but little did anyone suspect that the news reaching the world was actually sent by your friend. I journeyed through Persia, paid a brief but remarkable visit to Mecca, and called upon the Khalifa at Khartoum, the results of which I duly reported to the Foreign Office. Returning to France, I devoted several months to research on coal tar derivatives in a laboratory at Montpellier. By the time I concluded my work, only one of my enemies remained at large in London. I was preparing to return when news of the extraordinary Park Lane mystery reached me. It promised both a puzzle worthy of attention and an opportunity for some peculiarly personal business. I returned to London at once. I called personally at Baker Street, sending Mrs. Hudson into violent hysterics with my sudden appearance, and discovered that Mycroft had preserved my rooms and papers exactly as they had always been. So it was, my dear Watson, that at 2 o'clock that day I once more found myself in my old armchair in my familiar room with only one wish. How I longed to see my old friend Watson in the other chair, as he so often had been. That April evening I listened to a tale so remarkable it would have been incredible had it not been confirmed by the very figure before me, the tall, spare form and keen, eager face of a man I had never thought to see again. In some subtle way he seemed to know of my own recent sorrow, and his sympathy shone not in words, but in every measured gesture and quiet glance. "Work," Holmes said quietly, "is the finest cure for grief, my dear Watson, and tonight I have work for both of us, work which, if we see it through, may well justify a man's entire existence." I pressed him for details, but he refused with a faint smile. "You will see and hear enough before dawn. We have 3 lost years to speak of. That must suffice, until 9:30, when we begin the remarkable adventure of the empty house." At the appointed hour, it felt as though time itself had turned backward. I sat beside him in a hansom cab, my revolver secure in my coat, my pulse alive with that familiar thrill. Holmes was silent, cold, focused, carved from iron. The street lamps flashed across his sharp features, revealing furrowed brows and tightly set lips. I did not know what creature we hunted in the vast jungle of London's crime, but from the posture of this master tracker I knew the danger was grave, and the thin, sardonic smile that occasionally flickered across his face promised little mercy for our prey. I assumed we were bound for Baker Street, but Holmes stopped the cab abruptly at Cavendish Square. As he stepped down, his eyes swept the street with hawk-like precision. At every corner thereafter he paused, watching, listening, ensuring we were not followed. Our path grew stranger by the minute. Holmes led us through a twisting maze of alleys, mews, and forgotten stables, places I never knew existed. His confidence never wavered. At last we emerged onto a narrow road lined with dark, aging houses, passed into Manchester Street and then Blandford Street. There he turned sharply into a cramped passageway, slipped through a wooden gate into a deserted yard, and unlocked a back door with a key he already held. We stepped inside together. Holmes closed the door behind us. The house was pitch black. Every step we took groaned against the bare wooden floorboards. I reached out with one hand, brushing against walls where the wallpaper hung in tattered ribbons. Holmes's thin, cold fingers closed around my wrist, guiding us silently through a long, shadowed hall. Ahead, the murky glow of a fanlight above the door barely cut through the darkness. Suddenly, Holmes veered sharply to the right, and we stepped into a large square room. The corners were lost in deep shadow, the center faintly illuminated by the distant glow of streetlights outside. No lamp burned nearby, and the window was thick with dust, making it difficult even to make out each other's shapes. Holmes placed a hand on my shoulder, leaning close enough for me to feel his breath at my ear. "Do you know where we are?" he whispered. "Surely Baker Street?" I answered, straining to see through the gloom. "Precisely. Camden House," he said softly, "right opposite our old quarters. And why here?" Holmes's voice carried that sharp, teasing edge I remembered. "Because it gives us the perfect view of a very familiar pile. Now, my dear Watson, take care not to show yourself and come closer to the window. Look up at our old rooms, the birthplace of so many of your little adventures. Let us see if 3 years of absence have diminished my power to surprise you." I crept forward, heart thudding, and peered across at the familiar window. A gasp escaped me. The blind was drawn, and inside a strong golden light burned steadily. Against it, the shadow of a man seated in a chair was cast in sharp, unmistakable outline. Every detail, the tilt of the head, the squared shoulders, the hawk-like sharpness of the face, was perfect. It could be no one else. Holmes had returned. The face in the window was turned slightly to the side, frozen in profile, like one of those black silhouettes our grandparents used to frame. The likeness was flawless. It was Sherlock Holmes. I was so utterly stunned that I instinctively reached out, half expecting to feel his arm beside me. Holmes was trembling, silently laughing at my astonishment. "Well?" he murmured. "Good heavens!" I whispered. "It's extraordinary. I trust that age does not wither nor habit dull my infinite variety," he replied, and in his voice I heard the unmistakable pride of an artist admiring his finest work. "It does resemble me rather closely, does it not? I would swear under oath that it is you. The credit belongs to Monsieur Oscar Munier of Grenoble. He spent several days preparing the mold. The bust itself is wax. Everything else I arranged personally during my visit to Baker Street this afternoon." "But why?" I asked. "Because, my dear Watson, I had the strongest possible reason for convincing certain people that I was there, while in truth I was somewhere else entirely." "And you believed the rooms were being watched?" "I knew they were." "By whom?" "By my old enemies," Holmes replied quietly. "That delightful society whose leader now lies at the bottom of the Reichenbach Fall. Remember, Watson, they knew I was alive, only they, and sooner or later they were certain I would return to Baker Street. So they watched it relentlessly, and this very morning they saw me arrive. How can you be sure? Because I recognized their lookout when I glanced from the window. A harmless fellow, really, Parker by name, a garrotter by profession, and a surprisingly talented player of the Jew's harp. I gave him no thought at all." Holmes paused. His voice dropped, but I was deeply concerned by the man behind him. The closest friend of Moriarty, the one who hurled the stones from the cliff, the most cunning and dangerous criminal in all of London. Holmes turned his eyes towards me, sharp and gleaming in the half-light. That man, Watson, is hunting me tonight. And that same man has no idea that we are hunting him. My friend's strategy was slowly becoming clear to me. From this perfect hiding place, the watchers themselves were being watched. The hunters turned into prey. That sharp-edged silhouette across the street was nothing more than bait. We were the real predators. Side by side we stood in silence, wrapped in darkness, observing the restless figures drifting back and forth below. Holmes did not move. He did not speak. Yet I could sense the intense alertness in him, the rigid focus of his gaze locked onto the passing crowd. The night was bitter and unruly. The wind shrieked down the long street, cutting through coats and scarves alike. People hurried past, collars raised, faces hidden. More than once I felt certain I had seen the same man pass again. Two figures in particular caught my attention, standing in the doorway of a house farther up the street, clearly using it as shelter from the gale. I attempted to draw Holmes's attention to them. He responded with a sharp, irritated murmur, and never once took his eyes from the street. Time dragged on. His feet shifted. His fingers tapped nervously against the wall. I could feel it, his unease growing. Something was not unfolding as he had planned. As midnight crept closer, the street slowly emptied. Holmes began pacing the room, his agitation now impossible to hide. I was just about to speak when I glanced up at the illuminated window across the street and felt the same jolt of shock I had experienced earlier. I seized Holmes by the arm and pointed upward. "The shadow," I whispered urgently. "It's moved." It had. The familiar profile was gone. The figure had turned, now showing its back to us. Holmes turned sharply, irritation flashing across his features. 3 years of absence had done nothing to soften his temper, nor his impatience with slower minds. "Of course it's moved," he snapped. "Do you take me for such a ridiculous bungler, Watson, that I would construct an obvious dummy and expect the sharpest men in Europe to be fooled by it?" He paused, then added coldly, "We've been standing in this room for 2 hours. During that time, Mrs. Hudson has altered the position of that figure 8 times, once every 15 minutes. She worked from the front of the figure, keeping its shadow hidden from view." "Ah!" he inhaled sharply, a high, excited intake that made the silence even tenser. I saw him lean forward in the dim light, every muscle rigid, every sense straining. Outside, the street was utterly deserted. The 2 men I had noticed before may still have been lurking in the doorway, but they were now invisible to me. Darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by that brilliant yellow screen across the street, where the black figure remained sharply outlined in the center. A thin, sibilant note reached my ears, the unmistakable sound of someone barely containing their excitement. In an instant, Holmes pulled me back into the deepest shadow of the room, his hand pressed firmly against my lips, his fingers shook. Never before had I seen my friend so visibly stirred, and yet the street outside remained cold, still, and empty. Then I heard it, a faint, stealthy noise that Holmes had already detected with his keener senses, not from Baker Street, but from the back of the very house where we lay hidden. A door creaked open and shut. Footsteps followed, careful, slow, calculated, though still reverberating sharply through the empty house. Holmes crouched low against the wall, and I mirrored him, my hand closing over the handle of my revolver. Through the gloom I discerned a vague shape, darker than the shadows around it. A man. He paused for a heartbeat, then crept forward, crouched and menacing. He was within 3 yards of us. I braced for his sudden strike, only to realize he had no idea we were there. He moved silently toward the window, lifting it just half a foot. As he leaned to peer through, the streetlight spilled its full glow upon him, cutting through the dusty glass. And then I saw his face. Wild, frenzied with excitement, his eyes glittered like twin stars. Every feature twitched, every muscle seemed to convulse. This was a man utterly consumed by his own dark purpose. The man was elderly, his face a map of harsh lines and shadows. A thin, projecting nose, a high, bald forehead, and a huge, grizzled mustache gave him a sinister air. His opera hat was pushed back, and the gleam of an evening shirt front flashed beneath his open overcoat. Gaunt and swarthy, every scar and wrinkle seemed carved with cruelty. In his hand he carried what looked at first like a stick, but when he set it down, it clanged sharply against the floor, a warning of the metal within. From his pocket he drew a bulky object and began a meticulous mechanical task. Click, whir, grind, another click. His motions were precise, almost ritualistic, as he bent all his weight on a lever. Straightening, I saw it clearly, a gun with a strangely misshapen butt. He loaded it at the breech, snapped the lock, and crouched, resting the barrel on the window ledge. His long mustache drooped over the stock as one bright, calculating eye gleamed along the sights. A faint sigh of satisfaction escaped him. The target was set, the black silhouette on the yellow background, framed perfectly at the end of his foresight. For a heartbeat he froze, rigid, deadly. Then his finger tightened on the trigger. A sharp, high-pitched whiz cut through the room, followed by a silvery tinkle of shattered glass, and in that instant Holmes moved. Like a tiger, he sprang on the marksman's back, slamming him flat onto the floor. The man shot up, his strength convulsive, seizing Holmes by the throat. I swung the butt of my revolver against him. He went down again. I held him there, and Holmes blew a sharp, piercing whistle. The sound of pounding feet echoed from the street. Within moments, 2 uniformed policemen and a plainclothes detective burst through the front door, rushing into the room. The trap was sprung. The hunters had struck. "That you, Lestrade?" Holmes' voice cut through the tense air. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I took the job myself. It's good to see you back in London, sir." Holmes's eyes glinted. "I think you might need a little unofficial help, Lestrade. 3 undetected murders in 1 year won't do. Still, you handled the Molesey mystery fairly well, all things considered." We rose, the prisoner panting heavily, flanked by 2 stalwart constables. Outside, curious onlookers had begun to gather, their whispers carried on the night wind. Holmes stepped to the window, drew down the blinds, and Lestrade produced 2 candles, while the policemen uncovered their lanterns. Finally, I could see the man before us. It was a remarkable vigor, yet twisted with menace. The brow of a philosopher, the jaw of a sensualist. This man could have been capable of greatness or disaster. But the cruel blue eyes, heavy-lidded and cynical, the sharp, aggressive nose, and the furrowed, threatening brow revealed the plainest signs of danger. He ignored all of us, his gaze fixed solely on Holmes, a blend of hatred and disbelief flickering across his features. "You fiend," he muttered, almost under his breath. "You clever, clever fiend." "Ah, Colonel," said Holmes, adjusting his rumpled collar with the calm of a man who had seen it all. "Journeys end in lovers' meetings, as the old play says. I do not believe we have met since you saw me atop the ledge above the Reichenbach Fall." The colonel's eyes remained locked on Holmes, glazed as though in a trance. "You cunning, cunning fiend," was all he could say. Holmes, never one to waste ceremony, gestured. "I have not yet introduced you. Gentlemen, this is Colonel Sebastian Moran, once of Her Majesty's Indian Army, and without question the finest heavy game shot our Eastern Empire has ever produced. Am I correct, Colonel, in saying that your bag of tigers remains unbeaten?" A shiver ran through the room as Moran's face betrayed recognition, fear, and fury all at once. The trap had been sprung. The game was over. The fierce old man said nothing, his glare fixed like steel on Holmes. With his bristling mustache and savage eyes, he seemed less a man than a wild tiger ready to spring. "I am surprised," Holmes began calmly, "that my very simple stratagem should deceive so skilled a shikari. Surely you recognize it. You tether a young kid beneath a tree, lie in wait above with your rifle, and let the bait draw out the tiger. This empty house is my tree," he gestured around the shadowed room, "and you, Colonel, are my tiger." Holmes's finger traced the air, pointing at the various hidden firearms. "Perhaps you kept others in reserve, should more tigers appear, or should your aim fail. These," he said, nodding toward the weapons, "are my other guns. The parallel is perfect." Colonel Moran leapt forward with a snarl, but the constables held him fast. The rage etched across his face was terrifying, raw, animalistic fury. "I admit you surprised me in one detail," Holmes said, his tone crisp and deliberate. "I did not expect that you would occupy this empty house yourself, using the window as your vantage. I imagined you working from the street, where Lestrade and his men awaited. Aside from that, everything unfolded exactly as I foresaw." Moran turned sharply to the official detective. "You may or may not have lawful reason to arrest me, but I will not submit to the jibes of this man. If I am in the hands of the law, then let it be done properly and legally." Lestrade nodded. "Reasonable enough. Mr. Holmes, is there anything more you wish to add before we leave?" Holmes crouched to pick up the air gun from the floor, turning it over the practiced eye of a master. "An extraordinary weapon," he said quietly, almost reverently. "Noiseless, devastatingly powerful, constructed by von Herder, the blind German mechanic for the late Professor Moriarty himself. I have known of its existence for years, but never handled it until tonight. Lestrade, mark my words, this is no ordinary instrument, and these bullets," he held them carefully, "fit it perfectly. Study them well. One day they may save lives as surely as tonight they ended a conspiracy." The tension in the room was electric. Moran's eyes darted from Holmes to the weapons, calculating, furious, trapped. Outside, the night wind rattled the windows, as if echoing the final victory of the master detective over the criminal genius he had so long pursued. Lestrade's voice was steady, but there was a sparkle of pride in his eyes. "You can trust us to handle this, Mr. Holmes. Anything more to say?" Holmes shook his head slightly, a faint smile curling his thin lips. "Only one thing. What charge do you intend to bring?" Lestrade blinked. "What charge, sir? Surely attempted murder of Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes laughed softly, a low, dry sound. "Not at all, Lestrade. I have no intention of appearing in the matter. The credit and the full glory of this remarkable arrest belongs to you, and you alone. Truly, I congratulate you. With your unique blend of audacity and cunning, you've captured him." "Captured whom, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade asked, eyebrows rising. "The very man whom the entire force has sought in vain, Colonel Sebastian Moran. He is the one who fired the air gun through the open window of number 427 Park Lane, striking the Honorable Ronald Adair with that expanding bullet. That, my friend, is the charge, and you, Lestrade, have solved it." I felt a thrill run through me at the masterful way Holmes summarized the case. Then he turned to me, a gleam of mischief in his keen eyes. "Watson, if you can tolerate the chill from a broken window, I suggest half an hour in my study with a cigar. There you may find your reward in the details of the adventure, and perhaps some profitable amusement." As we entered Baker Street, the familiar sights greeted me with a strange mixture of nostalgia and delight. My old chambers, preserved meticulously by Mycroft and the ever-diligent Mrs. Hudson, had changed little over the years. The chemical corner, with its acid-stained tabletop, stood ready for new experiments. The violin case, the pipe rack, the Persian slipper brimming with tobacco, and the rows of formidable scrapbooks all remained where I remembered them. Mrs. Hudson beamed at us as we stepped in, a beacon of warmth amidst the shadows of the room. And in a corner, the silent witness of our night's adventure, the cleverly constructed dummy, stood as grim and lifelike as ever, a reminder of the cunning that had lured Moran into our trap. Holmes settled into his chair, eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Well, Watson," he said, "the game is done, the villain caught, and justice, if slow, is inexorable. But I promise you, the night's work is only part of the story. There are always lessons to be learned, and a doctor like you with nerves of steel will find them most instructive." The wax figure stood on a small pedestal, draped in Holmes' old dressing gown, its pose so lifelike that anyone passing on the street would swear the detective himself was seated there. The illusion was flawless. Holmes had outdone himself. "Did you take all the precautions, Mrs. Hudson?" he asked, eyes gleaming with approval. "I followed your instructions, sir, on my knees just as you said," she replied. "Excellent," Holmes said, nodding. "And the bullet, did it hit where we planned?" Mrs. Hudson held up a flattened lead projectile. "I'm afraid it has ruined the bust, sir. The bullet went clean through the head and flattened against the wall. I picked it up from the carpet." Holmes held it out to me, the soft, deformed metal gleaming in the dim lamplight. "A soft revolver bullet, Watson. Ingenious, isn't it? Who would expect such a thing from an air gun?" He turned back to Mrs. Hudson. "Your work has been impeccable. I am much obliged. Now, Watson, take your old seat once more. There are several matters I wish to review with you." With a swift motion, he shed the shabby frock coat, revealing the Holmes I knew and trusted, the Holmes of old, wrapped in his mouse-colored dressing gown, surveying the scene with the sharp, calculating eyes that had solved London's most perplexing crimes. "The nerves of the old shikari have not faltered, nor have his eyes lost their edge," he laughed softly, examining the shattered wax head. "Right through the center of the back of the skull, straight through the brain. That man was the finest shot India ever produced, and there are few in London who could match him. Have you heard the name before?" "No," I admitted. "Well, fame has its peculiarities," he mused, "though I suspect you were similarly ignorant of Professor James Moriarty, one of the great minds of the century. Now, let us consult the index of biographies." Holmes reached for the shelf with deliberate care, every gesture precise, every glance sharp as a hawk's. Even in recreation and rehearsal, the master detective's mind was ever alert, ready for the next move, the next revelation, the next triumph of reason over chaos. Holmes leaned back in his chair, lazily flipping through the pages of his well-worn ledger, a cloud of cigar smoke curling around his head. "My collection of M's is rather impressive," he said, with a faint smile. "Moriarty alone would make the letter illustrious. But then there's Morgan, the poisoner. Merridew of abominable memory, Matthews, who once knocked out my left canine at Charing Cross, and finally our friend of tonight. He handed me the book. I read aloud the entry. Moran, Sebastian, Colonel, unemployed, formerly 1st Bangalore Pioneers, board London 1840, son of Sir Augustus Moran, C.B., former British minister to Persia. Educated Eton and Oxford, served in Jawaki campaign, Afghan campaign, Cherasiab, dispatches, Sherpur and Kabul. Author of Heavy Game of the Western Himalayas, 1881, and 3 Months in the Jungle, 1884. Address, Conduit Street. Clubs, the Anglo-Indian, the Tankerville, and the Bagatelle Card Club. In the margin, written in Holmes's precise hand, was a single note: the second most dangerous man in London. I handed the volume back in awe. Incredible! His career reads like that of an honorable soldier. Holmes's eyes gleamed. True, Watson, up to a point. A man of iron nerve. The story is still told in India of how he crawled down a drain after a wounded man-eating tiger. But you see, some trees grow straight and noble to a certain height, and then abruptly twist into grotesque shapes. I believe humans can be much the same. A sudden turn to good or evil may reflect some hidden influence, a shadow from the past that courses through a family line. In essence, the individual becomes the sum of all his ancestors, the culmination of history, instinct, and circumstance. I frowned. Surely that is rather fanciful. Holmes only smiled, eyes glinting with that cold, sharp calculation. Perhaps, Watson, but it explains a great deal. Well, I won't insist on the theory, Holmes continued calmly. Whatever the cause, the fact remains Colonel Moran went bad, quietly. No scandal loud enough to echo back to England, yet enough to make India unbearable for him. He resigned his commission, returned to London, and there, once again, his name darkened. Holmes tapped ash from his cigar with deliberate care. That was when Professor Moriarty found him, or perhaps when Moran found Moriarty. For a time he became the professor's most trusted lieutenant. Moriarty financed him generously, but employed him sparingly, only for the sort of work that demanded precision, patience, and a cold nerve. Tasks no common criminal could survive. He glanced at me. Do you recall the death of Mrs. Stewart of Lauder back in 1887? I shook my head. I thought not. The case vanished as cleanly as the woman herself. Nothing provable, nothing visible, yet I am convinced Moran was behind it. He was so expertly concealed that even after the Moriarty network collapsed, we could not touch him. He leaned forward slightly. Do you remember when I visited your rooms and insisted on shuttering the windows? You thought me eccentric, afraid of shadows and draughts, but I knew exactly what I feared. I knew such a weapon existed, an air gun, silent, deadly, and I knew that one of the finest shots in the world was likely holding it. His voice darkened. When we went to Switzerland, Moran followed, side by side with Moriarty, and I have no doubt it was his hand that nearly ended my life on the ledge above the Reichenbach Falls. 5 minutes, Watson, 5 minutes of pure calculation and death. There was a brief silence before Holmes went on. During my time in France, I read the newspapers obsessively, not for pleasure, but hunting. As long as Moran walked free in London, my life was effectively forfeit. Sooner or later he would get his moment, and when he did, there would be no escape. I shifted uneasily. But what could you do? Nothing, Holmes said flatly. I could not shoot him without condemning myself. I could not approach a magistrate with what would sound like madness. Suspicion without proof is worthless in a court of law. So I waited. I watched the criminal columns. I followed the shadows. I knew his time would come. Holmes's eyes hardened. And then came the death of Ronald Adair. He paused, letting the names settle between us. At that moment, everything aligned. Knowing what I knew, knowing Moran's methods, his patience, his tools, was it not inevitable that he was responsible? He had played cards with the young man, he had followed him home from the club, he had fired through the open window. There could be no doubt of it. The bullets alone were damning enough to hang him. The moment I realized it, I came straight over. As I expected, I was spotted by the sentinel, who of course would alert Moran. That would force the colonel to connect my sudden presence with his crime. He would be alarmed, unnerved, and likely to act immediately, bringing his deadly weapon into play. I left a perfect mark in the window, my bait, and, having warned the police that their assistance might soon be needed— by the way, Watson, you identified them in that doorway with uncanny accuracy— I took up what I considered a judicious position for observation. Never did I imagine he would choose the same spot for his attack. "So, my dear Watson," Holmes said, turning to me with a slight smile, "does anything remain for me to explain?" "Yes," I replied. "You have not made clear what could possibly have driven Colonel Moran to murder the Honourable Ronald Adair." Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing. "Ah, Watson, there we enter the domain of conjecture, where even the most logical mind may err. One may form hypotheses, and each is as likely or as unlikely as the next. But yes, I have formed one." He paused, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. "The facts are not difficult to interpret. Evidence revealed that Moran and young Adair had won a considerable sum of money between them. Moran, as I long suspected, was unscrupulous. I believe that on the day of the murder, Adair discovered Moran's cheating. Most likely he confronted him privately, threatening to expose the deceit unless Moran resigned from the club and promised never to play cards again. It would have been unnatural for a young man like Adair to spark a public scandal by denouncing a well-known older man. His action, I surmise, was discreet, reasonable, and ultimately fatal, for it brought Moran to the breaking point. The exclusion from his clubs would have meant ruin to Moran, Watson. His livelihood depended entirely on those ill-gotten card winnings. So when Adair discovered the cheating and began to calculate how much he ought to return, profits he could not claim because of Moran's foul play, Moran acted. He murdered him. He locked the door to prevent any interruption, lest a curious lady stumble in and demand to know what he was doing with the names and coins. Do you follow? "I have no doubt, Holmes," I said, "that you have uncovered the truth." "Time will confirm or disprove it at the trial," he replied calmly. "Meanwhile, one way or another, Colonel Moran will trouble us no more. The remarkable air gun of von Herder will soon take its place in the Scotland Yard Museum, and once again I am free to devote myself to those curious little problems which the ever-complex life of London so generously provides."
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.